Elvis froze mid-strike, fingers hovering above the ivory keys. The cavernous silence of RCA Studio B pressed in. No engineers, no backup singers, just the hum of idle equipment. Then he heard it, a soft, ragged sob drifting from the shadows beyond the live room. He slipped off the bench, coat trailing behind him, and slipped through the half-open door into the dim back corridor. There, hunched on a crate of cable, sat a young black woman in a janitor's jumpsuit, her face buried in her arms. The scent of stale coffee and studio dust hung thick in the air. "Elvis Presley," she whispered without looking up, voice trembling. He didn't correct her. Instead, he knelt beside her and asked, "Miss, are you all right?" She lifted her head, eyes rimmed red, and for a moment he saw the weight of every unspoken dream she carried. "It's just," she said, voice cracking like an out-of-tune note, "I clean up after people chasing dreams. And I ain't got one left." In that fractured moment, between his rage at a failed take and her confession of abandonment, something real stirred in him. No spotlight, no applause, just two souls laid bare in the quiet of the night. Elvis slid the tape from the reel one last time, fingers trembling with frustration as the warm amber glow of the control room's VU meters flickered unevenly. It was nearly 3 a.m. in RCA Studio B, and the hush of the night pressed in on him, every creak of the overhead lights, every distant hum of the building's old wiring. He sank onto the piano bench, shoulders heavy with exhaustion from weeks of chasing that elusive spark in his recordings. His own voice had felt hollow in the booth, the notes flat, devoid of the fire he needed to reignite his passion. Somewhere beyond the glass, a soft sobbing drifted through the gloom, tentative and raw. Elvis froze, hands hovering above the ivory keys. The tearful sound was so fragile it could have been the wind, or a trick of his weary mind. But it was real. He stood, buttoned his black knit jacket against the chill, and crossed the studio floor, boots whispering against the worn wooden planks. He pushed open the door to the hall behind the live room and found her seated on an overturned cable crate in the shadowed alcove. A young woman in a simple housekeeping uniform stained with smudges of tape hiss and studio dust. Her shoulders shook, and a single bead of sweat rolled down the side of her cheek, gathering at her jaw before falling unseen. He paused in the doorway. "Miss," he said softly, voice a low murmur, "are you all right?" At the sound, she jerked upright as though awoken from a dream. Her eyes, dark and glistening, widened in confusion and fear. For a moment, she stared at him blankly, I'm fine," she stammered, voice rough and surprisingly fragile. She brushed a knot of hair from her forehead. "Elvis Presley, he said, stepping forward into the dim pool of light, not wanting to alarm her, yet letting her know who he was. "You don't have to hide back here." She shook her head, mouth tightening into a thin line. "No, Mr. Presley, I'm just sorry." He crouched down beside her, mindful of the crate's cold metal. "It's late," he observed. "You've been working a long shift." Her gaze drifted upward, and in her eyes he saw fatigue that ran deeper than tired bones. Something bruised, a hope extinguished. He studied the crease of her brow, the tremor in her hands resting on her knees. Finally he asked, his tone gentle, "What's your name?" "Alice. Alice Maynard." She answered, voice small. "Alice, this place can be unforgiving," he said, glancing toward the control room's darkened window. "But nobody should weep alone." She swallowed hard. "I used to sing," she whispered, as if the words themselves had become tainted. "Back home, I sang gospel in the choir. I had a tape, sent it to labels. They told me, Not quite what we're looking for. Then Mama got sick, and well, I'm the one who cleans up after people chasing dreams." She drew her knees up and hugged them as tears slid down her cheeks. "And I ain't got one left." Elvis felt a familiar ache twist in his chest, an echo of the loneliness he fought every night on stage. He reached without thinking, touching her shoulder. "Alice," he said softly, "I've spent weeks searching for something real in these songs I record." He paused, watching her face in the dim light. "If you could sing, if you'd let me hear your voice, maybe that's the truth I'm missing." She flinched at his request, head shaking so quickly her braided hair whipped the air. "No," she said firmly. "I can't." Her voice cracked in that last word. He nodded, rising from the crate. "Thank you for trying," he said, and swung the door open to return to the studio proper. He paused, hand on the knob, and looked back. Alice stood, hands fisted at her sides, silent and uncertain. Her sacrifice, forgoing her own dreams to survive, hung in the air like an unanswered prayer. He took a slow breath. "Sing that again," he called, voice carrying down the hallway. "Please, At that, she closed her eyes, lips trembling as she steadied her breath. And then, in the hush beyond the control room's glass, the first note slipped out, rich, wounded, and achingly beautiful, like the very heart of every broken song he'd ever tried to mend. He returned the next evening under cover of darkness, slipping into Studio B just as the last of the maintenance crew filtered out. The overhead fluorescents flickered softly, casting long, silent shadows across the plywood floor. Elvis glanced at the clock, 9:17 p.m., then made his way through the dim corridor to the small dressing room adjacent to the live booth. There, he found her, Alice Maynard, seated on a frail folding chair, hands twisted in the lap of her worn cleaning smock. She looked up, startled, as he stepped inside. Tonight, there was no apology in her posture, only guarded curiosity and a tremor that spoke of lingering fear. "Thank you for coming back," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. He held out a small slip of paper. "I need your voice, in here." Alice studied the note, its edges rough where he'd torn it from his notebook. He'd scribbled a time, 10 o'clock, and the simple direction, "Come alone." The request felt more urgent than polite, but she sensed no malice in his eyes, only a steel-edged empathy. She nodded once, sharply, and rose to follow him down the narrow hallway. As they walked, she caught the faint echo of her own footsteps mingled with his softer ones, two lives converging in the hush of night. In the live room, the giant Studer tape machine stood sentinel, its reels still. A single microphone hung from the ceiling, cord coiled like a silent serpent. The instruments were stowed away, guitars on hooks, drums dismantled, amplifiers shrouded in dust covers. It was as though the very space awaited something raw, something unpolished. Elvis approached the engineer's console. "Bob," he said, "we're going to lay down a take. Just voice, no headline, no name, just her." Bob's eyes widened in surprise, then gleamed with recognition. He nodded and queued up a clean tape. The soft click of the machine filled the room as the reels spun free. A red light blinked above the transport, and the silence fell once more. Alice stood before the microphone, uncertainty etched in every line of her silhouette. Elvis met her gaze and offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to hold back," he said. "Show me the song you thought was lost." She inhaled slowly, the breath rattling through her chest. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she opened her mouth. The first notes emerged deep and guarded, a smoky undercurrent of pain. She sang only a single verse of an old spiritual, "Precious Lord, take my hand," and her voice trembled, raw as new bark on a sapling. Elvis closed his eyes, every muscle in his body still. He felt that tender fracture in her tone, the way her vibrato wavered with unspoken grief. He had spent so long chasing perfection in his own recordings that he'd forgotten the power of imperfection to reveal truth. When her final note faded into the silence, the studio seemed to exhale. Bob lowered the faders, leaving only the faint hiss of tape. Elvis opened his eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he approached her and quietly said, "That's all I needed." Instead of offering praise, he slipped a worn leather pouch from inside his jacket pocket. He set it on the console. This is your share," he explained. Inside, 4 crisp bills, an unheard-of sum in that dimly lit room. "Use it to keep singing, or to get by, but don't let it scare you." Alice's mouth fell open. She took a step back, fingers brushing the pouch as though it might vanish at her touch. Tears pooled in her eyes, but she blinked fiercely, determined not to sob. "Mr. Presley," she murmured, "I can't accept this." He shook his head. "Yes, you can. I didn't ask for a performance tonight. I asked for honesty, and you gave it to me." His voice held a tenderness that made the words seem carved from velvet. Suddenly, the door to the live room cracked open and the studio manager poked his head in. His face went pale when he saw Elvis standing beside Alice with wads of cash on the console. "Sir, Aaron, are you certain?" Elvis turned to him coolly. "Absolutely. Make sure she gets the rest weekly, no questions asked. And don't put her name on any payroll." The manager stammered, caught between protocol and loyalty. Elvis simply nodded, then looked back at Alice. "You stay right here. I'll handle it." And with that, he left them alone again. The manager retreated, closing the door with a soft click. In the hush that followed, Alice sank onto the stool in front of the console, the leather pouch cradled in her hands like a fragile treasure. Elvis watched from the doorway, silhouette haloed by the corridor light. He held one hand to his chest, where the beat of his heart had slowed, steadied by something real, something larger than any applause. After a moment, he turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving Alice in the glow of the tape machine's red eye. Her tears now a quiet testament to an unexpected act of grace. In that rented refuge of strings and circuits, he had found a flicker of hope, not for a hit record, but for the healing power of simply listening. And for Alice Maynard, 25-year-old custodial worker and former gospel singer, the night's hush would echo with promise long after the reels stopped turning. The next morning, the southern sun had already begun its slow crawl through the blinds when Elvis strode into the RCA control room, Alice's tape in hand. He looked every bit the exhausted superstar, stubble rough on his jaw, dark circles under his eyes, but there was steel in his posture as he approached the engineer's panel. "Bob," he said quietly, setting the tape down. "I want her vocals on the mix." Bob Hale, the night engineer who'd worked the late shift, nearly spilled his coffee. "Her vocals, sir? Alice Maynard? She's our cleaning lady." Elvis cut him off with a nod. "She's uncredited talent, but it's the truth this record's been missing. I don't want a polished chorus this time. I want her voice, raw and real, on Only Believe." Bob glanced at the file folder on the desk, where executives had already annotated the track list for the upcoming album. Next to Only Believe, a note read, "No guest vocals." He swallowed. Sir, RCA policy. Elvis raised a hand. I know the policy. I'm asking you to break it. In the hush that followed, the hum of machinery in the room suddenly sounded oppressive. The view through the window framed the adjacent live room, empty now but still holding echoes of last night's session. Elvis's face softened as he looked at Alice's tape. That one verse, leave it exactly as is. No harmony. Just her. Bob hesitated, then reached for the phone. He dialed the production office, voice tense. Colonel, it's Bob. We have a situation. Elvis wants to insert non-union background vocals, and not just anyone. The crackle of the other end came. Bob, cut that. Get me the Colonel. Moments later, a gruff voice filled the room. What's this I hear about noir vocals on Presley's track? Elvis turned to face the speaker in the reflection of the glass. You heard right. I want Alice Maynard on the chorus. Silence. Then the stern reply. She's a cleaning lady, Presley. We can't afford the controversy. We'll lose airplay in the South. Elvis's eyes darkened. He set his jaw. Then I'll lose the record if I have to. But that voice belongs in the mix. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the Colonel's response crackled back. All right. But it goes down as a session vocalist. Understand? Elvis nodded once. Understood. By midday, Alice was summoned from the break room. She found Elvis waiting beside the same microphone they'd used before, the red tally light already glowing. He gave her a gentle nod. Just a few brief lines, like last night. She swallowed, stepping into the spotlight once more. Behind the glass, Bob and the producer watched with bated breath. Elvis counted in softly, and Alice began, only believe, all things are possible, only believe. Her voice trembled, but rang true, carrying the ache of her story. Elvis stayed just behind her, humming in low harmony, his concession to the label's direction that she remain unofficial. The blend of his smooth timbre with her raw gospel edge created a moment of holy tension, a tug between polished pop and unvarnished soul. When the final note faded, Elvis reached through the glass and held up two thumbs in quiet celebration. Alice exhaled, tears brimming again, but this time from triumph rather than despair. That afternoon, while the studio staff moved on to other tasks, Bob slipped Alice an unmarked envelope. From Mr. Presley, he said softly. Inside lay $3,000 in bills, enough to clear her rent arrears and secure her grandmother's medical care, and a small handwritten note. Keep believing. EP.Alice closed her eyes against the flood of emotion. She tried to push the envelope back, but Bob stopped her. He won't take it back, Bob said, surprising her with a quiet wink. He meant it. But the moment of generosity sparked a backlash. Word got out that a wealthy patron had helped a black woman, and the local radio stations in the more conservative markets threatened boycott unless RCA denounced the act. The label scrambled to contain the fallout. Press releases were drafted, promising charitable support for all employees, yet name-checked no one. Elvis wouldn't relent. That evening, he confronted the Colonel one last time in the executive suite, himself a man accustomed to bending wills with a phrase. This isn't charity, it's justice, he said, tapping the contract for the album. You can fight me, or you can let me make a record that's honest. There was a long pause before the Colonel sighed. Fine, Presley, but you're covering any legal fallout, and this stays off the credits. Elvis nodded, accepting the terms. He turned and left, fracturing the polished veneer of the industry with a simple act of defiance. In the weeks before release, rumors swirled. Fans detected an unusual undercurrent in the mix of only believe, but none knew the truth. Alice continued to work her shifts, envelope hidden in a drawer at home, afraid to spend more than a single bill at a time. But the tape itself found its way into Elvis's personal vault, the sole copy of that version locked away in a wooden case marked only, "Keep this one." For Alice, the memory of that day never wavered. She carried the faith that someone had heard her, truly heard her, and had chosen to believe. And for Elvis, who had once chased perfection in every note, the crack in the polished recording stood as a testament to something more profound, an unvarnished truth that no hit single could ever capture. In that collision of talent and compassion, they had both been changed. She, by the validation of her voice. He, by the reminder that real music lived in the cracks between polished lines. And though the world would sing many of his songs, the one he recorded with her would remain his quietest and most radical declaration of faith. Late one autumn evening in 1971, 2 years after that clandestine studio session, Elvis found himself alone in Graceland's jungle room, cradling the unmarked reel-to-reel box stamped simply with EP, Keep This One. He slid the tape onto the ancient player and, in the hush of the teak-paneled room, pressed play. Alice's voice, fragile, honest, insistent, filled the warm lamplight. Only believe. All things are possible. Only believe. He closed his eyes, feeling each syllable land in the hollow where his own confidence had once lived. When the music ended, there was no roar of applause, no cheering crowd, just the silence of a house built on memory. For Elvis, it was a revelation. The real magic wasn't in the spectacle, but in the simple act of lifting someone else's dream into the light. In the years that followed, the tape stayed tucked away in his private vault, a secret witness to a moment of grace between a star and a cleaning lady, a raw testament that defied all the glossy singles and platinum albums. Friends and family would occasionally hear snippets of that long-lost tape, and each time Elvis would shake his head, a wistful smile crossing his lips. "Nobody else needs to hear that," he'd whisper. "It's ours." After Elvis's death in 1977, Graceland opened its doors to thousands of mourners, each hoping for one last glimpse of the king. Among the belongings catalogued and sealed, the tape was carefully preserved by Joe Esposito, who remembered the night vividly, the flicker of lamplight, the unvarnished truth of Alice's voice, and Elvis's quiet insistence that it remain between them. Decades passed. The music industry shifted and spun on, new genres rose and fell, and the legend of Elvis grew ever larger, even as the raw honesty of that hidden recording remained unheard, a ghost among gold records. In 2010, when Graceland was in the process of digitizing and archiving its vast collection, an unlabeled box surfaced in the archives. EP, Keep This One. Curators were mystified. Nothing in the official inventory matched that title. The mystery deepened until a young archivist named Sarah Carter played the reel. Her eyes widened as Alice's warm tenor and Elvis's low hum intertwined in the brittle night air. She called Joe Esposito, now well into his 80s, who confirmed the story. He laughed softly, tears in his eyes. "That was never meant for the world," he said. "It was his gift to her, and his reminder to himself." Moved by the fragile beauty of the recording, Sarah conceived a plan. With the blessing of Elvis's estate, she would release the track, not as a commercial single, but as part of an immersive exhibit at Graceland, where visitors could step into a reconstructed 1969 RCA control room and hear Alice's and Elvis's voices pour from the original tape machine. It would be accompanied by photographs of Alice, then a young woman with wary eyes and a determined spirit, and by a silent tribute listing her name among the many unsung heroes who had shaped Elvis's life behind the scenes. On opening night, a hush fell over the crowd of historians, fans, and local residents as the exhibit's vintage speakers crackled to life. Alice's lines echoed in the dim light, followed by Elvis's gentle harmony. A ripple of emotion passed through the audience. Some wept, others sat in stunned silence, and a few nodded with recognition, as though they too had found their own cracked record of truth restored. Among the visitors was Alice's daughter, now in her early 40s, and a nurse at the local hospital. Clutching a small, framed photograph of her mother, taken in the studio doorway, she stepped forward when the lights came up. In a quiet voice, she addressed the assembly. "My mother never had a platform to share her voice, but because he heard her, she found her way back to song, and then to service, using her gift to help others heal. His kindness wasn't an act of charity. It was an act of faith in a fellow human being." As the exhibit drew to a close, guests were invited to write a brief note of gratitude or remembrance on vintage postcards and drop them into a wooden collection box. Thousands of cards filled with thanks for "the man who looked beyond fame" and "the woman whose song saved his soul" bore witness to a truth more powerful than any hit record. That genuine compassion resonates long after the final note fades. When the last postcard was tucked away, the curator closed the exhibit with one final audio, that same personal message from Elvis, recorded 2 decades earlier. "Keep believing. Sometimes a voice finds you when you've lost your own." And in that moment, surrounded by echoes of cottonwood and the soft glow of lamplight, the legend of the king and his unsung angel found its fullest expression. Not in the applause of stadiums, but in the enduring silence of hearts that still listen.